Action.
What do you think of when you think of superheroes? Typically as adults, it's kind of skews the line. But whenever we're kids, we think of people such as Superman. People that idolize the sort of superpowers, all these responsibilities, and all the powers that come with it. And despite facing adversity, whether it's through everyday means or trying to save the world, somehow they end up on top. That's how sometimes we can sometimes give these characteristics to adults in our lives, typically our parents. And in my case, that's exactly what I did. And that's the reason for my commemorative speech today. It's over my parents the reasons that I've attributed these, especially my mom, these superpower abilities, and how somehow they're able to overcome adversity and rise up on top. In this case, raising my sister and I. So, we naturally idolize our parents because of, it's typically the first people we have within our lives, our biological parents, both of them. So, I look up to my parents for many reasons, and despite the fact that it is kind of a cliche that my commemorative speech is about them, it's a little different. I'm turning it on its head because I look at my mom as a positive influence in my life and my biological father as a negative influence, things to avoid. So, I will cover 3 important things. The first being the early life of both my parents. Following that will be the early life that I had with both my parents. And lastly, the direct influences that I've had throughout my life because of the parenting and the life I spent with them, basically. The early life of both my parents were fairly similar. Both came from very poor farming communities in Mexico, let it be known. So it's a little bit different from the American lifestyle. But nonetheless, they were both very, very poor growing up. And they had their parents, and their siblings that they had. So my mother, she was born up with 7 other siblings, of which she was the eldest. And at the same time, in between going to school and raising them, she did have a part-time job to help the family, despite being the typical laborers of the farming community. My father was the youngest of 3, and unlike my mother, he was the youngest, and he was always taken care of from both his parents and his siblings alike. At this point, they both decided to go to America. My father ended up going into the country illegally, and to this day still ends up being here illegally, to the best of my knowledge. While as my mother, around the 20s or so, she ended up immigrating here, getting her green card and her visa, and she was able to stay here. Hers was a little bit lengthier process, and that's another reason why I admire her, because she did go into this country legally. Next, we're going to take a big jump in the time lapse, and at this point, it's where now you can see through the photo, my sister and I with my mother right there in the center. Earlier years, and if you can read the first point, it says father leaves. So at this point, it's fairly self-explanatory. My father did end up abandoning the family around when I was 5 or 6 or so, and luckily my mother stayed behind. So my mother was a single mother, as obviously, and she raised my sister and I from that age up until we are now. And needless to say, it was a very difficult situation that she was put into. Because as we know, that is a growing problem within America nowadays, and it takes a pretty heavy toll. So despite raising my sister and I as a single mother, she had to end up taking 3 part-time jobs and working at a university where she eventually ended up getting her master's in which. Afterwards, she got her degree in education, and she was able to become a teacher. That was a lifelong passion of hers to always help out other individuals, because despite coming from a lowly point in her life, even from growing up to going into America and being a single mom, she always tried to help out other people, despite the fact that she herself was in dire need of help as well. Next, the direct influences. So, like I said, despite the fact that I admire both of my parents for what they did, it's for differing reasons. My mother served to be the caring and the very compassionate side of which I greatly admire, obviously, because she was that motivational person in my life that always pushed me forward and told me the reasons why we need to constantly help ourselves, because sometimes there won't be other people that we can lean on in these circumstances. Whereas my father, I see, is kind of motivation, but to things to always avoid. He wasn't necessarily the positive influence in my life. From what my mother has always told me of him, is that he was never really there, and anytime he did show up, it was basically just to sleep and drink and just hang out. He never really did much as far as taking my sister out and nurturing us or being that fatherly figure. And given the fact that he did leave, that's a pretty important factor into why I not only see him as someone I would never want to mirror in actions, per se. Next, my mother was very determined and motivated. Despite the cards that she was given, she was raising 2 children, working jobs, at a university, and then eventually ended up getting her degree and becoming a teacher. If that doesn't say like an American success story, I don't know which will. At this point, I'd like you to reflect all personally on your lives as we kind of give thanks to the things we have in these lives. Because we are given cards and we have to determine whether or not we're going to assess them in a negative light or in a positive light. Because there are negative things that will happen in our lives, but it's how we acknowledge them and how we basically react to them is obviously going to be the biggest problem with this. Because my mother was handed bad cards, as was I, but despite all of this, it was the fact that she had such a positive outlook on these things and did the best with what she was given that I myself was able to do the same. And the fact that I always have this positive figure to look forward to and the negative figure in the background showing me exactly what I should never mirror. And if I ever see myself starting to fall into that side, I know that I can always reach out to my mother and ask her for help, because she's been there, she's done that, and she's always been that positive influence to push us forward, both my sister and I. And to this day, I can say we are in a success story of the American family, the first generation of Americans, because we were born on this soil, and despite coming from a very poor family, that we were able to rise above and conquer. Bibliography, that's it. Thank you.